Eczema seems to be such a common condition in babies, and having navigated eczema with our firstborn, I think it's a real challenge to understand and treat properly as a parent. So this week, I'm very excited to be joined by an expert dermatologist, Dr Ellie Rashid.
1 in 5 children have atopic dermatitis or eczema, 1 in 10 adults will have it, but it's a real spectrum. So some could have it relatively mildly, affecting more typical sites like the creases of the skin, and some have the other end of the spectrum where they have it very severely.
It impacts everything. It impacts their behaviour the next day, their ability to learn.
Understanding a child's seasonal pattern, their eczema behaviour, some people have a variation throughout the day, just understanding all of that and being able to come up with a treatment plan and a skincare plan to support them and try and bring things under control is essential.
Hello, I'm Pip, and welcome to the Midwife Pip podcast, the home of expert information and real chats on all things pregnancy, birth, and beyond. Eczema seems to be such a common condition in babies, and having navigated eczema with our firstborn, I think it's a real challenge to understand and treat properly as a parent. So this week, I'm very excited to be joined by an expert dermatologist, Dr Ellie Rashid, to help us myth bust, understand, and move through all the noise around eczema in babies and in young children. So welcome, Dr Ellie, and thank you so much for letting us steal you away from what I know is a very busy clinic schedule that you run, to kind of pick your brains really on this common condition.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The first thing I would love to understand, because I feel like when you become a doctor, become a medic, there are so many areas that you could go into and you could specialize in. What drew you to skin and dermatology?
So at medical school in my 4th year, I had a placement with the dermatology department, and the dermatologists there were just so happy. They were so lovely. The variety of things that they got to see in clinic. Some of them were doing a pediatric dermatology clinic, some were doing an adult clinic, some were doing skin cancer, medical dermatology, so things like eczema and psoriasis. And I just thought it's such a varied specialty. And the team were so nice and so warm and welcoming and all seemed genuinely happy in their jobs. And I thought, that's the sort of career that I want to embark on. And interestingly, we've just had our British Association of Dermatologists meeting at annual conference, and I saw the dermatologist that was the most inspiring in the department, and I told him how much he had inspired me to pursue dermatology. And someone within the conference told me how I had inspired her to pursue a career in dermatology. So I think, it's a lovely, lovely specialty.
How amazing. And doesn't it show us how the people that we meet along our journeys in life are so highly influential to the things that we do? Like, that's
Completely.
such a beautiful story. I love that. It's such a beautiful story. Now, Ellie, I know we were talking a little bit before we hit record, and I was explaining how, and I think I've talked about this probably on the podcast before for those avid listeners, that we, have and are really navigating eczema in our household. And I think, especially with eczema in babies and young children, because it's common, because their skin is so sensitive, I feel like because it's talked about so much, we've almost normalized it and therefore underestimated how uncomfortable and actually sometimes debilitating it can be for children. And I know I mentioned that, for our son who loves water and loves his baths, when his eczema's flaring, it's just really sore and uncomfortable. And as a parent, you feel horrendous because all you want to do is make sure that they're happy and thriving. Yeah. And you feel really, really helpless. Would you mind kind of explaining to us what eczema actually is? Because I think often when we hear terms all the time, we don't really think about understanding it. We just kind of normalize that it's a skin thing and they might grow out of it and they might not.
Yeah, so eczema we would call atopic dermatitis, because eczema actually has quite a broad number of subtypes, and atopic dermatitis is the most common subtype of eczema. So most people use the words interchangeably, but it is very common. 1 in 5 children have atopic dermatitis or eczema, 1 in 10 Adults will have it, but it's a real spectrum. So some could have it relatively mildly, affecting more typical sites like the creases of the skin, and some have the other end of the spectrum where they have it very severely. We know that there's a genetic component to it, and usually if people have other factors like hay fever or asthma, for example, or food allergies within their family, then they might be more susceptible to developing eczema. And it's something to do with a protein that's in the uppermost layer of our skin that forms our skin barrier. So people always wonder, well, what do we mean by, we use the word skin barrier all the time. And so the skin barrier is the uppermost layer of skin. It's these made up of these cells that are arranged like a brick wall. And there's a protein that holds these bricks really tightly and neatly together. And in people that have eczema, they might have a problem with the production of that protein, and therefore their bricks aren't so tightly and neatly held together. So there are gaps and cracks within these bricks, within these cells, and that means that water can escape from the skin, and the skin is left dehydrated and dry, and then their immune system responds to that. So it sets off this immune cascade, which results in this inflammatory component, and people get red, inflamed, dry, itchy. And it can be extremely uncomfortable for people and has so many other effects on so many other parts of them. Um, and in some cases, it can be quite straightforward to manage, and in some cases, it really isn't straightforward to manage.
That is the best way I've actually ever heard it explained. I feel like I
Oh,
spoke to, in our private life, I feel like I spoke to so many dermatologists and doctors about Finley's eczema and skin, but that's the best I've ever heard it kind of
oh,
described. That makes complete sense. And I think, for parents, because they're so vulnerable and little, aren't they? And especially babies and young children, they don't like the creams. They don't feel nice. They don't want to have cream put on them because they find that irritating. And so the whole kind of ordeal can be so much more complex, I think, to manage sometimes than perhaps in the kind of adult population. Do you find that you have lots of children coming to you with kind of skin issues, Ellie, or do you find that you have more adults?
and so I do both. I do a pediatric dermatology clinic and an adult dermatology clinic. And within my adult clinic, I see the more severe subtypes of eczema that are on some of these more advanced therapies that we sometimes use. Um, so I guess I see all ages. I see the full spectrum, but it is more common in children. And by the age of 7, approximately two-thirds of people would have grown out of it. So the third that haven't grown out of it, approximately three-quarters would have grown out of it by the time they're 16. So most do grow out of it. But I think sometimes when we relay that message to parents or to people, if they haven't grown out of it, they seem quite frustrated by that. And why am I the minority that hasn't grown out of my eczema? And really, with eczema, people ask, is there a cure for it? And I always tell them it's all about managing and controlling your eczema. You may well grow out of it, and we can have it under control whilst you go through that journey. And if it's not controlled and it's not and you've not grown out of it, then we might have to embark on some of these more advanced therapies.
It's reassuring though, I think, to know that there are lots of different options, especially through that life cycle, not just children, but also into kind of adulthood as well. And you've explained beautifully what causes eczema, but when does it typically start, Ellie? Can it start kind of much younger, or does it tend to kind of happen later on in kind of baby, so childhood years? When do you tend to see it start to show its signs?
So it normally starts very, very early on. So some people within a few weeks of life can start showing signs of eczema. Um, and it could progressively potentially get worse. And some people don't really show any signs of, like you were saying earlier before we recorded, don't show any signs of eczema. And then suddenly it just develops, and you think, where has this come from out of the blue? And I think that's a little bit more tricky because you sort of think that, well, they're not going to have a problem, and then suddenly they do, and you have to get all your tools together to think, how am I going to now tackle this problem?
Absolutely. And that was totally me. That was 100% me. I was like, brilliant. I felt kind of smug. I was like, he was genetically slightly doomed with his dad's genes with eczema. And I felt really like, brilliant. We did our research and I've kind of done all the things that I thought would help and we're good. And then I was saying to Dr. Ellie that 10 days after I stopped breastfeeding Finley at about 17 months, he was absolutely covered in eczema from having beautiful, beautiful baby toddler skin. And I was heartbroken. I was like, no, what's happened to my baby?
Oh.
And then felt that guilt of maybe I should have breastfed him till he was 2, because that's, the World Health Organization recommendation. And all of that kind of, cascade that in my rational brain is quite ridiculous. But in that moment, obviously feels really, really important. And when we decided we were going to start a family, Ellie, because I was conscious of my husband's eczema, I did lots of kind of research into things that we could try to do to help in terms of gut health and then probiotics for him when he was born. I even got rid of all of like the chemicals in the house and did like all natural ones, anything I could possibly try. Is there any way of kind of in an anecdotal or an evidence-based way of preventing or helping to prevent eczema in your experience?
So I think if you've got the genes for developing eczema, you probably will develop it. I think things that can be controlled to a certain extent is the severity potentially of eczema and how quickly you can bring things under control. If we imagine the inflammatory cascade that happens with eczema, so your skin is dry and then your immune system sort of kickstarts this cycle. When we then scratch our skin, and it's incredible to watch these babies that really don't have much control of any movement, but seem to be able to itch and scratch themselves. I always find it fascinating to watch. So when they scratch their skin, which is what you do when things feel itchy, then the skin responds to being scratched, to that trauma from being scratched. And one of the things that can happen is the skin thickens up in response to being scratched. And that in itself sets off this further cycle of the the inflamed thickened skin being itchy in its own right. So then it's very hard to break the cycle. The longer that goes on for, the more you scratch, the thicker the skin can become, and the longer the whole thing goes on for. So I think there are things that one can do to try and minimize irritants within the environment, irritants that we might be putting onto our skin. For example, certain fragrance chemicals people can be very sensitive to. Dermatologists would normally recommend fragrance-free products, sort of emollients or moisturizers, and soap substitute. So we wouldn't normally recommend a soap, but we would recommend something else to cleanse the skin with. I think certain things within the household that we don't think about, but like plug-in fragrances, reed diffusers, things like that can also contribute towards the severity of someone's eczema, or in fact just give them a different type of eczema, like an irritant or a contact or an allergic type of eczema.
Got you. That makes sense in terms of like actually the genetic component is so strong. It then just becomes kind of how severe that kind of spectrum might be, or what type, I suppose, of eczema that a child may develop. One of the things I'm always interested in as a midwife, Ellie, when I sort of speak to mums about bathing their babies, is I often recommend really delaying that first bath to try and protect baby skin. Is that something that you kind of recommend also?
I recommend exactly the same. So it's counterintuitive, but people think the bath could help to moisturize the skin. But actually, when you're in the bath, or if you have a prolonged length of time within a bath, it dries your skin out further. So we normally ask parents to put a layer of moisturizer or an emollient, and I'll probably use those words interchangeably, but meaning the same thing, on the baby's skin. But it does it makes the baby a little bit slippy, so
It
you do
does
have
make
to
them
be
very
careful.
sleepy.
And then as soon as they finish with their bath, after they've towel dried, to put another layer of moisturizer on, just to really try and lock in the moisture, because having a prolonged bath can make you more dry.
And in terms of moisturizers for babies, Ellie, is that something you recommend from the get-go, that parents regularly moisturize their baby skin, or leave it well alone unless there's a problem? What's your kind of thoughts?
So my recommendation is to moisturize from the get-go, and there's some evidence to back up that recommendation. What I usually don't use is sort of food-based oil, so coconut oil, almond oil. I normally ask parents to avoid those just because if you have inflamed skin and these breaks and cracks within the brick wall, so our skin barrier is defective, then sometimes those food proteins might go into the skin, and then because it's bypassed the gut system, you might develop antibodies. Then it might bring on food allergies. So I normally say to try and avoid sort of food-based emollients. It's the same even if babies have sort of cracked eczema on the face, for example, and then when they're sort of eating and they get it all over. Sometimes if you've not adequately treated the eczema and the skin barrier is very defective, then some of those food proteins go in, and then you can develop antibodies to those foods.
Wow, that's really interesting because we know that those kind of allergic conditions in terms of food allergies, eczema and asthma are quite interlinked, aren't they? Often if you've got one, you are more susceptible to kind of others. So actually that makes complete sense, but I've never thought of it kind of in that light. And I guess it's another reason why controlling eczema in little people and babies and young children is so vital, because absolutely more food is going to go over their face, their arms, their tummies than probably in their mouth.
Exactly. I think eczema has so many consequences. It really affects people's sleep, and sleep disturbance, not having good. I mean, babies aren't. Their sleep is already disrupted so significantly. Our sleep is so disrupted. So I think if you then have someone with itchy skin, up all night scratching, just makes life pretty miserable. They're tired. The parents are tired. So I think getting eczema under control is really important. And also it could potentially reduce the severity of eczema.
I remember that last summer, actually, Ellie, with our toddler, was the first time that his eczema really interfered with his sleep. And it was awful. And in the middle of
Mm,
the night when it's hot and all you can try and do really is cool them down, it's so, so tough. And like you say, it impacts everything. It impacts their behavior the next day, their ability to learn, like so, so multifactorial, I think, especially in young people with all of that kind of developmental kind of stuff going on that we want to protect. It's really, really hard.
absolutely.
So talk to me about some treatments for eczema. How should it be treated? Because you've alluded to the fact that there are different types of eczema. So presumably that's where we need to start in terms of actually identifying what type it is.
So in some people, if there is, if it's atopic dermatitis and it's their immune system, then we want to try and reduce inflammation. When we think about eczema treatment, I normally divide it into two. So you want to try and improve the skin barrier, and I do that usually with recommending moisturizers and soap substitutes. But they're not great at reducing the inflammation that's in the skin. So they're good at trying to repair the skin barrier, but not so great at calming down that redness and that rough sort of texture that people with eczema can have. So in order to do that, I normally recommend something to bring down inflammation, like a topical steroid cream. Now, topical steroid creams, of course, as parents, you want to be able to control a child's eczema, baby's eczema, without needing to really use anything medicated or prescribed. That is the ideal scenario. But in some circumstances, we will need something to try and calm things down. If the moisturizer and the soap substitute and repairing the skin barrier does enough to calm things down, great. I'm really happy with that scenario. But if it's not calming things down effectively, then we might have to use a topical steroid. And topical steroids come in different potencies. So there's not just one topical steroid, there are lots of different topical steroids. And we could try with a very mild topical steroid to see how well that brings things down and calms down the inflammation. And if it doesn't, then we might have to move on to a moderate potency topical steroid. In some cases, we go to the most potent topical steroids to bring things under control. Then there are another type of cream that we also use that's not steroid based, but it works by reducing inflammation. The problem with it is that if you put it onto very inflamed skin, it can hurt a little bit, it stings. So I normally say, let's calm it down with some topical steroids. And then we can use these alternative creams to try and keep things calm. And the licensing for those other creams depends on the age of the child. So for one of them, it's from 3 months of age. For one of them, it's from 2 years, and for the other one, it's 16 years old.
So I guess that's where it's really important that your child is actually assessed by someone like yourself, a specialist in this area, to allow you to make that treatment plan and have that kind of review process. Because I've certainly found that our management in the winter is a lot easier, to be honest, than in the summer. And I feel like, our winter regime was working quite well. And since we've had that hot weather, it's gone AWOL again. And that's where having that kind of regular contact with someone that knows your child and their kind of eczema patterns, I guess, is quite important.
It's crucial, and not every family fits that profile. Lots of families in the winter, actually, their skin is much worse because putting on the central heating tends to flare their eczema. Things that ignite your immune system. So if you have a cold, for example, that can really set off people's eczema, and you're more prone to getting coughs and colds over the winter months. The sun in some people can be an anti-inflammatory. So if they're on a sunny holiday, for example, or if it's sunny here, which it doesn't seem to be at the moment.
Not right now. Last week was quite nice.
Exactly. Then sometimes their eczema is better. But exactly as you say, some people actually getting hot and sweaty just makes everything worse. So understanding a child's seasonal pattern, their eczema behavior, some people have a variation throughout the day. Just understanding all of that and being able to come up with a treatment plan and a skincare plan to support them and try and bring things under control is essential.
Definitely, definitely. And in terms of avoidance with eczema, is there anything that parents should avoid or things they should look out for in products that could make things worse if their child has got trouble with their skin?
So most eczema formulated products will not have a fragrance, will not have fragrance chemicals within them. So that's something to definitely avoid. And then there's an ingredient which they're called humectants. So things like glycerin, for example, hyaluronic acid. So these draw water towards them. So essentially, they help to keep the moisture within the skin and reduce the risk of it evaporating from this defective skin barrier. So those ingredients can be really helpful. So things like ceramides, glycerin, hyaluronic acid, those types of ingredients can be helpful to look out for. There are lots of brands that are marketed towards eczema prone skin. They normally can't say eczema if they're over the counter. They normally say dry prone skin because they can't use the medical terms. But yeah, things that are formulated for dry prone skin.
It's such a difficult one, isn't it? I think because marketing can be so clever. So I love that you gave some of those examples that I will not try and repeat because I won't be able to say them. But I love that you gave some of those examples of the exact ingredients to look out for because I do think sometimes marketing in skincare, like it can in, food and all sorts, can be quite misleading for parents. And then there's this, mass range of different products of different price points, different kind of USPs, and it's like where do you even start? So actually looking for those specific ingredients is a really, really helpful tip, I think, for parents navigating the boots aisle.
It's really difficult. And now you've got social media, which makes it even more tricky to know what
Mm.
to buy, and things just start trending. And parents are desperate, their children are desperate, and often things that are promoted on social media, people will just buy. And sometimes they don't have the right ingredients within them, and they're not quite doing the job that they've marketed to do. And also, sometimes you can buy something online that's marketed at making your eczema much better, and it's marketed as being a completely natural product, but actually it's got a very potent steroid with it within the formulation. But you wouldn't know because the ingredient, people might not know what that ingredient represents. And it's
Mm.
only when you look within the ingredients that you can see that actually it's got a really potent steroid within it.
So yeah, having that guidance from, a medical practitioner is really, really important. So yeah, I definitely urge if you are listening and your child is navigating eczema and like Dr. Ellie said, you've seen something on social media or, great Aunt Jones recommended something, then, working with a medical practitioner is so, so important. Now, Ellie, you've shared so many tips, But everyone that comes on the podcast, I always ask for three top tips. So I wondered if you could share with us three top tips for parents navigating eczema.
My three top tips would be to avoid fragrance chemicals, because they can sometimes make things worse. To use a regular emollient or moisturizer, one that you like the feel of, one that your child likes the feel of, one that you can get them in spray formulations, one that you can sort of get them engaged with the whole putting moisturizer on process, because it is tricky. And to try and avoid soaps. Um, so to use something like some sort of emollient or an oil-based cleanser, for example, to try and avoid things getting even more dry when you're in the bath or shower.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Ellie, if people want to follow you on social media or even come and see you, whereabouts can they find you?
So on social media, I'm just Dr. Ellie Rashid on Instagram, and I work in a busy NHS London practice, but I also do private practice at One Welbeck.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of your reassuring words and helpful guidance to parents as well. Thank you so much, Ellie.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.